Greetings, everyone. This is Abhivardhan from the Bharat Pacific. We have an interesting guest again for the Bharat Pacific interviews. With Aditya Jakki, I will be interviewing our guest. So let me introduce Dr. Sana Hashmi. If I'm right. Dr. Sana Hashmi is a postdoctoral fellow at the Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation. Um, Her work on the Indo-Pacific and Indo-Taiwanese relations, especially what's happening in Taiwan, matters a lot, considering her experience in the Ministry of External Affairs in the past, and obviously her, I would say, academic research she has done in JNU, India. So, in this, even in the past, I would not say that Dr. Hashmi is our guest because we have hosted her in the past on the Indo-Pacific, China's relationship with Taiwan, on India's relationship with Taiwan. So, in this interview, we will reassess and readdress, what's happening in Taiwan, because um, uh, her take on how the Quad should take up Taiwan is quite interesting, and we would like to know more of that. So, uh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Abhivardhan. And it's my second time on your show. So it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I think it's very important, specifically in India, that we talk about the Indo Pacific, we talk about Taiwan. Of course, there's a lot of interest on Taiwan in India now. But I think it's very important to have meaningful conversation. And I think you are doing a great job for that. So, to answer your first question about Quad and what is the place for Taiwan and what Quad countries could do, I think it's a very important platform, specifically given it was the first minilateral within the Indo Pacific. And in fact, even before the Indo Pacific began to take shape, quadrilateral dialogue was revived. So, I think this is telling of how important and how significant quadrilateral dialogue is for the stability in the Indo Pacific region. And specifically, when we have four pioneers of the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, India, and the US coming together and working on primarily on an issue-based. It's an issue-based coalition. There is no denying that China's aggression was at the core of the revival of the Quad, and even the emergence of the Indo-Pacific construct has a lot to do with China's aggression. Of course, it's changing shape with a lot of countries endorsing the Indo-Pacific. Every country has a very different interest approaches and how they view China, how they view the other Indo-Pacific countries, and how they're viewing the US-China rivalry. So, of course, I feel it's changing shape, but we can't really deny the fact that when it was started, when it all started taking shape, China was at the center of it. So I think this automatically makes Taiwan a very important and critical factor for the Indo-Pacific and even for the quadrilateral dialogue. A lot of people have talked about Quad Plus and all, and I don't think Taiwan could really become an official part of any grouping, specifically when there are different countries with different interests and different relationship with Taiwan. And we know that India has been a little cautious with engaging with Taiwan. And of course, India's policy has changed with respect to Taiwan. There are subtle changes which I could talk about later. But I feel that there is a need for quadrilateral countries to talk more about Taiwan. And one of the major features, tenets of the Indo-Pacific is to maintain the stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific. And if there is a potential Taiwan contingency in the future, this very stability would be impacted. So I think it's a responsibility of the pioneer Indo-Pacific countries to think about what is their individual responses going to be, and also what is the response of the Quad going to be. Of course, Quad hasn't really acquired a latent security dimension yet officially, but we know that Quad is doing a lot of things that could be categorized under the security category. And specifically, and I think I've tweeted about this a lot, that India is one country that's actually adding this security component within the Quad. Look at Malabar and other, in fact, bilateral exercises. So now anything and everything could be clubbed within the Indo-Pacific construct. So I believe that India is one country, and given the threat from China, of course, you can't really compare the level of threat of from China to Taiwan and India. It's very different. For Taiwan, it's a matter of survival. But I feel that India still is, apart from Taiwan, was the only country that had to face escalation from China, especially during the pandemic. So I think it's India. This is one of the reasons why India is being very proactive, specifically while conducting bilateral exercises. For bilateral exercises, they have been India has been conducting bilateral exercises for a very long time with a lot of countries. But now I think the intensity has increased, and in fact, the inclusion of Australia within the Malabar exercise, this tells us that how India is really trying to inject the security component within the Quad. So I think India should be the one country who should understand what Taiwan is going through, and India should understand the tactic that have been kind of employed by China. So I think there should be this within the Indo-Pacific construct how like-minded countries should cooperate within the issue-based in an issue-based manner. I think this is something that India should look at, and India should support Taiwan. So I feel that within the quadrilateral dialogue, there needs to be more discussion about Taiwan. There should be more discussion about how Taiwan could be included within the Indo-Pacific construct, and how this Taiwan contingency could be averted. I don't think we should talk about how what should be countries' responses if China invades Taiwan. What we need to talk about is how to deter China. And I think quadrilateral is one of the most important platforms to talk about that.
Certainly. Aditya would like to ask a question.
Yes. Now, if we let's go back few months back, and if we see like there was the visit of Nancy Pelosi to the Taiwan with a delegation, and then there was a lot of media coverage. There was a lot of um, perhaps reportage saying that this is unprecedented, and to an extent that is true. But however, how much was it overblown, and how much is it actually historic in the sense that it was it actually unprecedented in the sense that will it set new paradigm in the way like the world functions with Taiwan? Like is it like a path-breaking decisions by the United States what it did? Because I want to understand its significance from the past crisis at the Taiwan Strait, like the 54 crisis, 58 crisis, then the crisis during Li Tenghui's visit to his former alma mater, Cornell University. So how does this figure out? Like, is it one of those? Okay, someone has gone, then there is nothing again for next 10, 15 years. Is it one of those, or we will be seeing more such initiatives by US or like other Indo-Pacific partners?
I don't think there was it was a departure from the past. In fact, a lot of parliamentary visits have been taking place from the US, from European countries. So I don't think there was a departure from the past, and that was nothing that was unprecedented about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Of course, it got a lot of attention primarily because of the status of Pelosi in the US system, as well as how China's reaction was. So I think this is something that really got a lot of attention towards Pelosi's visit. And I think if I have to answer your question, you asked me this question about China's reaction. Was it overblown? I think it was an exaggerated response to something that has been happening for a very, very long time. And of course, US Taiwan relationship, the nature of this relationship is definitely changing. There is more assurance from the US side for sure, specifically since the Donald Trump's time. We know that Donald Trump was primarily using Taiwan as a card against China, but now we look at what US has been doing I think there is definitely more assurance, more assurance of commitment from the US side. And in fact, it's backed by actions. And a lot of people actually called this visit symbolic, that what actually Taiwan or US achieved out of the visit. And I think there are a lot of things that Taiwan achieved from the visit. And I've written a lot about, specifically during that time, I wrote about why it was important for Taiwan and why the US did it. And in fact, the rationale behind China's reaction. So I believe that it's very important for Taiwan when Taiwan is isolated at a global stage, and specifically during the pandemic. Taiwan couldn't get any information from the WHO. It tried to warn the world. It tried to warn the WHO about the virus, but its word couldn't really get out. So, the world is also kind of being deprived of what Taiwan has to contribute towards the international community. And also at the same time, Taiwan is not being able to get the information inside. So, what it did during the pandemic was entirely its own initiative. And it did control the pandemic really well, but it was primarily because of his prior experiences. So why can't other countries benefit from Taiwan's experiences? And it was primarily because of China. So what has been happening with Taiwan, I think till 2019, till 2020, China was kind of content with whatever it was doing with Taiwan, such as poaching its diplomatic allies, shrinking its international space, and not allowing Taiwan to really go out and talk to other countries and be a part of international organization. And why? Primarily because Taiwan DPP, the current government, refused to accept the so-called 1992 consensus and emphasized on the self-determination to the Taiwanese people. So I think till 2019, till 2020, before the onset of the pandemic and before Taiwan began to gain a lot of attention, China was kind of content with isolating Taiwan, and eventually perhaps they thought that if Taiwan is isolated, then peaceful unification would be easier to handle. But with this increasing and this growing popularity of Taiwan among the international community, among the civil society, and even at the government level, we have seen how, especially joint statements with the US and G7 statements, there has been a mention of the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So this is something that's not really liked by China, and it's a kind of increasing the Chinese anxieties with respect to Taiwan. So in fact, that's one of the reasons why China's reaction was how it was. But apart from that, I feel that Pelosi's visit wasn't really a reason or an excuse for conducting live fire drill around the Taiwan Strait. Of course, they wanted to show that, if you keep talking to Taiwan, if you keep engaging Taiwan, and if you treat Taiwan as a country, we are going to show you that we can block Taiwan, and you won't be able to do anything. So I think this was one of the reasons why they went ahead with that. But apart from that, I think they were just looking for an excuse to conduct an exercise like that. Like, how do you justify your aggression? There needs to be a reason behind that. So they just used Pelosi's visit, and apart from that, like how there were a lot of statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from officials. It wasn't just about social media and trolls talking about that, but there were officials who actually said, some of them, the media people there, they actually said that China would shoot Pelosi's visit. So now, if you say things like that, you have to at least do something, even if it means just conducting exercises to block at Taiwan. So I think this was another reason. But apart from that, it was also to check how committed US is for Taiwan. And of course, the US response was very low, specifically after Pelosi's visit. They didn't really want to provoke China, but this was also one of the reasons. And then apart from that, they also wanted to check how prepared Taiwan is. So these were some of the reasons. So I won't really call Pelosi's visit a reason for a justification for China's aggression. China has been militarily intimidating Taiwan. This is what they have been doing for a very, very long time. The only difference is that the Ministry of National Defense is making it public, the incursions into Taiwan's ADIZ. But this has been happening for a very, very long time. And you also ask about the Strait crisis. I won't really call it a fourth Strait crisis, because the nature, the intensity was very different from the previous Strait crisis. So I won't really call it. Of course, being in Taiwan, it was very different. People were all normal, and it's not because they were oblivion to the threat from the Chinese side. It was just that they are so used to living under this threat for such a long time that it didn't really matter. So they have been seeing it for a very, very long time. And what they were saying, that what else could happen? We have been seeing this for a very long time. We are not going for conflict. And there's this prevalent opinion that China is not going to invade Taiwan, not in a foreseeable future. So I think this is something that's very common, that's very normal here. So I won't really categorize whatever happened after Pelosi's visit as the fourth Strait crisis.
Just to follow up on that, because like the reason why I was saying perhaps is, can it be categorized as fourth Strait crisis? It was not an isolated incident in the sense. I mean, some of it is also coincidence. After the Pelosi visit, the high pitch narrative, then there was the 20th Party Congress. Then there were everyone writing something about like how Xi Jinping has consolidated power, and now he has enough leverage to focus more on Taiwan, basically. Perhaps at the moment he is focused more on domestic aspects of COVID crisis, but he has got enough power in consolidation of power with him to do that. And again, few weeks immediately after that, there was this local elections in Taiwan, where like the party that is generally seen as that is more favorable to the Chinese establishment has won the local elections. So each may be different from each other, but again, it may be completely coincidental. But because all these three were back to back in the similar period and all were together in the news. So maybe perhaps how does that play into the narrative, and how much each matter into the larger narrative? That is why I put my question in that
So
sense.
I feel it's a very valid question and how you are linking it. But first, I'll answer your question about the local elections. So, of course, the KMT, especially at the local level, there are a lot of KMT mayors in Taiwan, and this is not something that was very surprising. And that doesn't mean that uh, we are going to see the same trend in the presidential election as well. So, I think what DPP did was to highlight the China factor, and they actually used that, if you are voting for DPP, you're also defending democracy and you're voting against China. So this is something that didn't really work with the people, and that actually tells us that people, when they vote at the local level, they aren't really voting, they aren't really thinking about China. What they're thinking about local issues. They're thinking about rent. They're thinking about gas. They're thinking about anything that impacts our daily life. So I think this is telling that China wasn't really a factor in local election, and saying that if KMT has won, that actually means the KMT is largely considered as pro-China, but that's actually debatable now because they have a very different ideology from that of DPP. But if KMT is in power at local level, it doesn't mean that now cross-strait relations are going to be better, because it's totally different. And we have to see what happens in 2024, because in 2018 also a lot of KMT had a very good win in local election, but what we saw in 2020 was very different from what happened in the local election. Of course, there's a lot of discontent with the DPP right now, and there's a lot of searching that's happening within the DPP. But I don't think that's any indication towards how people are going to vote in the next presidential election. But no matter what, even if China wasn't a factor in the local elections, China is definitely going to be a factor in the presidential election. So let's see how it goes. We still have more than a year to go with for the local election. But about consolidation of power, and then if she is more secure, and now he has secured third term, his intention is going to be more towards Taiwan. What I'm seeing is totally opposite of that, actually. I think in the run up to the 20th Party Congress, what we saw was more rhetoric from the Chinese side and more aggression with respect to Taiwan. Specifically during the 20th Party Congress, we didn't really see a lot of. And then, of course, he talked about Taiwan in his speech, but then that was a very usual stuff that has been happening. He didn't really devote a lot of time on Taiwan during his speech in the 20th Party Congress. And in fact, what I'm seeing, of course, domestic protest and what is happening specifically after the abandonment of the zero COVID policy. The news that is coming out of China, it's pretty sad what's happening in China with respect to COVID. So, of course, the focus is on domestic politics, but even before the protest uh, started, and even before the zero COVID policy was abandoned, I didn't really see a lot of rhetoric or aggression on Taiwan after the 20th Party Congress. So I think now he's secure. He doesn't have to really show at home that, Taiwan is still, of course, Taiwan will remain higher in the list of priorities for Xi Jinping and for the CCP leadership. But it doesn't mean that the invasion is just around the corner. He has already consolidated his power. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And I think my prediction is what we're going to see is mellowed down approach on Taiwan. Of course, the ADIZ incursion and all these statements, the warrior diplomacy specifically on Taiwan is going to be there. Of course, now what we are seeing that the wolf warrior diplomacy is kind of mellowed down with other countries, but with Taiwan is going to be there. It has been there since forever. So all these things, economic coercion, military intimidation, and then changing the narrative and cyber attacks, these are the things that China has been doing with Taiwan for a very, very long time. And if you ask me, in the aftermath of Pelosi's visit and the 20th Party Congress, and perhaps once China is more stabilized, we are going to see more of it. The intensity might increase, but China's approach is not going to differ from how it has been for a very long time.
All right, so I have a question, which is regarding a very peculiar statement by a Chinese ambassador in France. And you rightly pointed out in a tweet that, I mean, everybody in China thinks, I'm talking about a diplomatic class, not the people, obviously, that, oh, the Indo Pacific is a US strategy. It's a US led strategy, or it's a US led concept. But they then forget the role of former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, and others, right? So, we have seen the situation in Tawang, and I think this is something which happens in every 2 years or every year, anyhow. It's not something like, Galwan, but it happens in certain forms because I think the India is trying to bridge the gap of developing infrastructure at the border quickly so as to address the issue with China, because uh, during the Vajpayee era also the LAC was encouraged even by Beijing in certain ways to keep the things going, but then also pressurize India in certain ways. So how do you see this?
No, I think that statement actually tells us by Chinese ambassador to France that how, in fact, we have known about this fact that how they perceive Indo-Pacific and how they perceive India's presence in the Indo-Pacific. But I think this has been reiterated again and now the entire discussion about how they're viewing India, and specifically with when it's during the time of the Tawang incursion in the Tawang sector. So I think what the Chinese have not been able to appreciate is that was actually promoted by an Asian leader. But I think primarily due to the US-China geopolitical rivalry, and no matter what, as I've already mentioned, that China's aggression and China's containing China's rise is at the core of the Indo-Pacific. Of course, it's primarily by the US, but no matter what, US is one of the pioneers of the Indo-Pacific. We can't, of course, it was first talked about at the official level by Shinzo Abe by Japan, but it began to gain more prominence with the US presence in the Indo Pacific. And there's also no denying that Indo Pacific, now what we see of what the Indo Pacific is primarily because of India's inclusion. India wasn't really a part of the Asia Pacific narrative. So to include India, because India is the only country in the region that could truly contain China, and this is something that China is also very well aware of. So no matter what, Indo-Pacific is India is at the core of the Indo-Pacific, and India's capability to contain China and to keep China preoccupied with this uh, China coalition strategy. So I believe that this is one of the reasons that Chinese officials and Chinese leadership are stuck with or are stuck at. And so I believe that when we talk about containing China and when we talk about containing China's aggression, so when you talk about the US, what US wants to do is to contain China because we talk about US relative decline and China is going to surpass the US economy in coming years. So how do you stop China? You stop China by getting like-minded countries together, and you have strategies like what China has been, what the US has been doing specifically with the chip curve now. This is primarily to contain China's economic rise. But then now, when you talk about India, India has a totally different reason to be a part of the Indo Pacific construct or to be a part of the Quad. India is doing it primarily because India has been facing Chinese aggression incursion at the LAC since 1986 specifically, and it's not a new thing. But now, what this current administration has been doing is to give a befitting response to China. This is something that China didn't expect from India. Like we have been seeing, look at Daulat Beg Oldie, look at Doklam, and even before that, even if we had CBM signed, even if we had agreement signed, incursions weren't really gone. They have been here. So now the nature of incursions have changed. For example, the violent clashes. This is something that we keep talking about, that was the first time in 40 years that soldiers were killed at the LAC. So this, of course, changed India's policy towards China. But the response that China has been getting from India and the suspension of the high-level dialogue. Imagine there was this country who accepted China's proposal to have informal summits, and we did have two informal summits. Of course, after the second informal summit, we got to know that this is not really giving us anything. We are not really yielding results. But I think this idea that the it's not about differing perception, the very idea that China is primarily doing to contain India and to keep India preoccupied. And why? Because China is just looking everything through the prism of US China rivalry. This idea that India is just a pawn or a small player in the US China rivalry, and India is doing whatever the US is asking India to do it. So, China sees India as a junior partner. And what they are seeing is that India is also, and I think this is what the perception is, that India is also a junior partner to the US, and to contain China in the region, US is using India and India is using what the US wants India to do it. So I think this entire idea of that this is a battle between two superpowers, and then all other countries are just choosing cabin. This is what Chinese leaders, Chinese officials keep saying, that this is a new Cold War mentality, that the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, is all a part of this new Cold War mentality. And now, even if countries don't say it, they are a part of camp. So now, what I see when Xi Jinping goes to Saudi Arabia, when Xi Jinping goes to Southeast Asia, what he's trying to do is to find countries to be in its camp. And even if Xi Jinping doesn't really find or convince countries to be a part of the Chinese camp, I think one of the statements that keep coming out of China, specifically after the visit, is that at least these countries are not really being a part. These countries are being neutral. So I think even this has become a kind of an achievement for China, that they are not choosing sides in this geopolitical rivalry. But there are countries that are definitely choosing to be a part of the so-called Chinese camp. Look at Russia, look at somewhat Central Asian countries. But now there is a lot of different approaches that we are seeing from the ASEAN Southeast Asian countries. And I'll give you an example of their statement during the Taiwan Strait tensions. Earlier, they used to really blame Taiwan, or to some extent US, for the tension in the cross-strait relations. But now the statement was kind of very neutral. So definitely, I feel that China, if you talk about image building, and if you talk about how countries are perceiving China, China is definitely losing on that front.
Just to compliment on Abhivardhan's earlier question on your comments on containment, like it's not about two superpowers, there is it, there are other powers. So I want to specifically talk about how, where Japan fits in, how Japan and Taiwan equation is fitting in, because compared to former colonies, Taiwan is one rare region where Japan has really goodwill. It doesn't have that colonial baggage. People, I mean, as the people say, Taiwanese people like what Japan does. There is a good government-to-government relations, and Japan actually personally invests a lot of its money resources in Taiwan. So recently, there has been national security strategy in Japan. They have released the vision for next 5 years, more military spending, more defense spending. And in the past, Japanese defense minister, if I'm not wrong, it was Taro Kono, who has said that Taiwan Strait is the gateway to the next Senkaku crisis. If Taiwan falls, then it's also like the big, perhaps it's as much a big crisis for Japan as it was anywhere in the past. So can you just put that in the context, like where does Japan fit in, like where it is going in terms of China?
I think you talked about Japan's colonization of Taiwan. That was, in fact, I think that's one of the few positive examples of colonialism. I don't know if I could actually say that, but here I look at Taiwan, and how Japan and Japanese are loved in Taiwan. Like, for all their vacations, they actually mostly they go to Japan. Yeah, you talk to any average Taiwanese, and they'd be like, "Yeah, we have gone to Japan, and we love Japanese food." There's a lot of influence, a very positive influence of Japan on Taiwan. So I think that has definitely played a role between how people-to-people relations between Japanese and Taiwanese are. But also, I feel when we talk about the threat, and when we talk about Japan's support to Taiwan, it's more about geography. For India and Taiwan, I would say that it's more about how they are facing the same threat. Of course, Japan is also facing the threat from China. Like, for example, what happened during the live fire exercises. Missiles flew over Taipei and went to Japan's exclusive economic zone. So I think geographically, Japan is situated at a very unfortunate position. So this is something that has kind of motivated Japan's support for Taiwan. And in fact, the statement that Taiwan security is directly linked to that of Japan is a huge statement, and tells us about how serious they are, and in a way, it also tells us what the response is going to be in a potential Taiwan contingency, and they're actually preparing for that. Look at their own maritime dispute with China, even North Korea's frequent test, and now Taiwan. So, in fact, their defense budget is increasing rapidly, and this is something that's not really liked by the Chinese. We keep seeing this statement. So, I think Taiwan is one of the major factors. But apart from that, apart from showing statement, apart from increasing their own defense budget, they're actually being very. I think there is this. They're very proactive towards Taiwan. There is party-to-party dialogue. There's a lot of engagement. There's a lot of discussion and interaction. And I feel, of course. Uh, with India as well, with other countries as well, there's a lot of interaction, and even at the government level, if not at the ministerial level, at least at the deputy ministerial level and senior official level. But in India, you won't even get to hear about all those things. There's a lot of secrecy behind all these things. But with Japan, I feel that they are more vocal and more open about their engagement. Of course, they won't really tell you everything what's happening between Japan and Taiwan. There's a lot of military exchange. There's a lot of information exchange that's happening. But I feel they're still more vocal and open about engaging Taiwan and how to support Taiwan in a potential Taiwan contingency. And they're also talking to other Indo-Pacific partners, for example, US and Australia. So I think this is something that's really benefiting Taiwan, and it kind of give Taiwan an assurance that Taiwan is not alone. So I think Japanese statement from Japan, from deputy ministers, from ministers, and even from officials, we keep hearing all these statements with respect to Taiwan. And you already mentioned about the importance of stability in the Taiwan Strait and Taiwan security in the NSS and in all other. I don't think any official statement or document has even come out without a mention of Taiwan in it. So this actually tells us how important Taiwan is for Japan and how much importance they have been giving, attaching significance attaching to Taiwan.
All right. So we'll then talk about certain other regions or certain other countries as to how they look at Taiwan and what is your perspective? Because I'll be very honest. I think your analysis is one of the most, I would say, practical analysis on what's around Taiwan and not just about Indo-Pacific and India and China. So uh, I mean, you might remember this, that during the Trump administration's time, there was a spat between the Czech Republic's foreign minister, or maybe a diplomat, I don't exactly remember, and their Chinese counterpart. So not exactly Wang Yi, but I think it was the Chinese ambassador in Czech Republic in Prague, and they had some spat or something. And we have been seeing that Europe has been trying to express their support for the Taiwanese. So um, considering the situation in Ukraine and all so forth, uh, it seems sometimes that Europe's approach is more passive. At least we can say that the US and India are more pragmatic to go ahead with and at least taking the subtle steps, like you rightly mentioned. But Europe seems to be a little bit out of the game or out of the league on this. So, what do you think about Europe's approach to Taiwan for now?
Of course, if you're just asking about a unified approach towards Taiwan, European unified approach, I don't really see this going to happen. As any other region like Southeast Asia, Europe is also very divided. We saw German Chancellor went to China, and how much invested Germany is in China. And I think major economies have a very different approach when they look at Taiwan and when they look at China. We haven't really seen much from, at least at the leadership side, from France and Germany, that they are very proactive towards Taiwan, apart from the usual statement. But when we talk about EU, when we talk about Europe, one thing that I would like to bring to your attention is the Central Eastern European countries. You already mentioned about this spat between foreign ministers of China and Czechia. So I think Czech Republic is one country, and apart from that, Lithuania and Poland, they are being more proactive towards Taiwan. And it's primarily because I think one of the reasons was they didn't really get a lot of attention from China. Much of China's attention went to major European economies. And there were other reasons as well, but now, and there's a joke that the 17 plus 1 or whatever, like now 16 plus 1, 14 plus 1, now it's just going to be China, and all the European countries are going to go out of it. So I think there is no unified approach, but there's still a lot of support from Europe towards Taiwan, specifically from Central and Eastern European countries. Look at Lithuania. Lithuania was allowed Taiwan to open its representative office with the name of Taiwan in it. And now there's a lot of attention from Taiwan side as well that has been given to Lithuania. Lithuanian products in Taiwan is a hit. And why? Because they supported Taiwan. And you talk about Lithuanian chocolates. If they come to Taiwan market, it just sold out within a few hours or within a few days. And this is what happened with the Australian wine. When China imposed 200% tariff of Australian wine, it became a hit here. The entire campaign of Freedom Wine became a hit, and they started supporting countries against Chinese economic coercion. So I think with respect to Europe, there's a lot of bonhomie between Europe and Taiwan right now. And that's primarily, of course, from the Central European and Eastern European countries, we are seeing that even deputy ministers are coming on official visits to Taiwan, primarily to enhance, to strengthen economic ties. But this is something that's unprecedented. I think this is happening after a very, very long time, that countries are actually shedding their hesitance, and all these ministers are coming to Taiwan. Of course, we saw in 2020 the US Alex Azar, the head secretary, came to Taiwan, and state health secretary, and then there were other visits as well. So of course, US started it, and I feel that when US became more proactive with Taiwan, then other countries, specifically other Western countries, became also proactive with Taiwan. But I feel that if you talk about the parliamentary support for Taiwan, it's very much widespread in the entire Europe. We have seen a lot of parliamentary visits from even France, even Germany, even bigger European economies. So I feel that if you talk about civil society, if you talk about the support from the executive branch of the government, we really see a lot of support, and we really see a lot of visits from there. I think every now and then at least we get two delegation visits from European country to Taiwan. So I believe there's a lot of discussion about Taiwan in Europe. And it's also because Europe is also trying to find and navigate their own interest and place in the Indo-Pacific. And there's no denying that Taiwan plays a critical role in the Indo-Pacific. You can't talk about Indo-Pacific and not talk about Taiwan. You have to talk about Taiwan. So I think this is something that's also driving their policies towards Taiwan in a huge way.
So, like, I want to bit come back to like the India-Taiwan question, basically. Like, I want to understand in the recent context, like there have been increasing delegation level visits from both sides, like Taiwan, India. Like we see that the ruling party MPs, though not at the highest official, like the MPs keep on commenting, and I am sure it's more strategic. Like at certain level, they want to keep those comments going on Taiwanese issues. Then we saw recently like how India kind of talked about militarization of Taiwan Straits after Chinese ambassador in Sri Lanka commented on India's past security issues in the region. Then I mean there has been like a gradual like build up of Indian. It's kind of like there is some kind of a Indian position on it, but still there is no position. Like, and I think it's by design. It's not to confuse, but it's by design. So in this context, where does like and future of Taiwan-India relations fit in? Where does like the economic agreements? I think FTA is being discussed, but I don't know how far it has gone, or like the especially I'm more interested in like the science and tech research collaborations, and that is where I think India sees more potential with respect to Taiwan. And the complementary question to like the second layered question to this, and which is kind of a complementary question to what Abhivardhan asking, where does other countries fit in? Now, India has been championing this reformed multilateralism in multilateral institutions, in United Nations, in all other countries. So, where does Taiwan fit in this future idea of reforming the multilateral institutions? So, do you see more role for Taiwan or like the negotiate voice in behalf of Taiwan? Like Taiwan should get more voice in UN or other multilateral institutions. So yes.
No, definitely. I think I'll answer your last question first. Taiwan should definitely get assume a greater role and should get a place at the high table in the multilateral organization. But of course, the status of Taiwan and the entire problem and drama about what name to use, and China is not going to allow Taiwan's participation if it doesn't use the name Chinese Taipei. So that's a problem, and China has more authority there to stop Taiwan's inclusion participation. And other countries should definitely advocate for Taiwan's greater participation in international organization. And in the beginning, I mentioned that it's mutually beneficial for both Taiwan and, in fact, the organization and other countries as well. Taiwan has immense experience in certain fields, so why not utilize Taiwan's best practices and learn from its best practices? But this is something that we can't really see, even if countries come up with statements, and even if countries start really pushing China, it's really difficult. But what they can do is just to have their own kind of mini platform, minilateral or multilateral platform where Taiwan could be included. As in, these countries have to find a way to include Taiwan, which has around 24 million people. How could you, then this is, I think this is very inhuman for the international community and for other countries as well. It's even if the status is in split, the country status, but then no matter what, there are real people. It's a self-governed island, so countries have to think about it. So yeah, and about your question on India-Taiwan relationship, I think what India has been trying to do is to advance the existing areas of cooperation. Even earlier, of course, there were a lot of agreements that have been signed. I'm not saying that there was no progress. There has been progress. There has been steady yet slow progress. But what the current focus has been on is to strengthen those areas. So I always used to say that basics of India-Taiwan relations are not in place. We talk about information exchange in the military field. We talk about such big achieving bigger goals. But what about, we don't even have direct flight between Taipei and New Delhi. So how do we even talk about strengthening ties, and then India talking about Taiwan at the global level, and then pushing China to do something for Taiwan? It's not going to happen. You have to first talk about basics in the relationship. So I think this is a very good approach from the Indian side, that what we are trying to do is to strengthen economic ties, to strengthen science and technology ties. This is, and the visits have been happening for a very long time, specifically in the economic field. This is something that's not really publicized, but if you look deeper, if you dig deeper, you would find that the visits have been happening. And in fact, there is an economic dialogue at the deputy minister level as well. This is why Taiwan's deputy economic minister was in India. And there are several other dialogues that take place and that are not even in the public domain, but exchanges and interactions do take place between India and Taiwan. But what I believe is India and Taiwan relations are only going to be more consolidated if economic stakes in the relationship is increased. Like, you talk about Taiwan and you talk about India's interest, but India is not going to talk about Taiwan unless its interests are really prominent. Right now, what India's interests are primarily diaspora, and second interest is, of course, economic. But look at the bilateral trade; it's not even reached 10 billion yet. Look at the level of investment; it's so abysmally low, despite all this talk about Foxconn and other Taiwanese companies coming to India. Is pretty low. So we really have to do something about that. There's a lot of potential, and specifically in the semiconductor industry, there's a lot happening. But I think, to summarize, I would say that India's Taiwan policy is definitely changing. India is not really taking a bigger or huge step, because any policy change on Taiwan would be irreversible. You can't just do something with Taiwan today and tomorrow say that no, we are not going to do this because it's going to provoke China. So we know that a relationship with China is not going to be normalized in the foreseeable future. And I'm not saying it because I feel that India is only going to go for Taiwan when the relationship between China and India is further deteriorated. But I think what it has made India realize that the relationship is not going to be normalized, and they shouldn't really overlook engagement with Taiwan because of China. If China is not paying any heed to India's sensitivities and interest, territorial integrity, why should we do that? So I think this is a realization that has kind of triggered India to look towards Taiwan. But I do see positive, subtle policy changes with respect to Taiwan, and I'm very optimistic about India-Taiwan relationship.
It's interesting that you mention about irreversibility, because that is one of the factors that people undermine and they don't discuss or mention, and they go with aggressive narratives like, okay, we should be talking, but yeah, that is in fact the center of the argument, irreversibility basically.
All right, so I think we will conclude with this interview. I think it was an amazing discussion. I guess the developments with respect to Taiwan will be slow, but as rightly pointed out, I guess on the economic front, we may see a lot. Uh, at least I know for a fact that policymakers in India are getting heavily serious on the semiconductor upfront to begin with, because our state governments have to do. So I think, let us see. I think there are interesting times ahead. We look at the PLI scheme and all those things. So I guess it was an incredible interview. I thank the speaker for coming up. And viewers, I hope you must have enjoyed this discussion. Thanks, Aditya. And it certainly has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Aditya and Abhiva.